Medieval winters weren't just cold, they were punishment. No insulation, no thermodynamics, just wind that could flay a monk's conscience and ice thick enough to entomb your regrets. People called it God's season because only divine rage could explain why your livestock froze standing up. In 1315, the Great Famine arrived with rain rotting crops into foamy sludge and sending people into the forests to dig for edible bark, as cuisine. They didn't salt roads, they salted children's corpses to delay decay. In Strasbourg, church bells froze mid-peal. In Scotland, chronicles praised a January so ruthless it froze the birds upon the bough. Prayer was the heating system. Amen. And when peasants died curled into their own smoke-stained thatched roofs, clergy called it divine selection. Frozen to death must have been a sinner. Heating was moral, not material. Faith was mandatory, so was frostbite. Winter wasn't a season, it was a siege. The sun disappeared behind clouds thick as cathedral walls, and the days sagged down to a few hours of sour light. Firewood ran out before the hope did, which frankly wasn't hard. In 1315, during the Great Famine, villagers in northern France were caught boiling the hides off plague-ridden oxen just to chew the glue. That counted as dinner. Monks at St. Albans documented parents abandoning children to God's will, which is a monastic way of saying, we ran out of soup and patience. Nothing grew. Salt meat turned green. Grain bins became rat buffets, assuming the rats didn't freeze first. And the church, radiant as ever, blamed it all on sin, because what's frostbite without guilt? Food riots started in London 1316. By then the angels had frozen to the rafters. Congratulations, your house is a fridge. Not like a fridge, it is one. In the winter of 1315, temperatures plummeted and Europe forgot how to chew. Crops froze, livestock refused to be livestock, and suddenly everyone's that one guy who buys ice cream during a blackout. Roofs leaked, fires smothered themselves, and walls let the wind in like an ex-wife with a key. Insulation, try wattle and daub, a polite term for woven sticks smeared with mud and livestock memories. Monks slept under stiff wool blankets that might as well have been frostbite origami. Children shared beds with pigs for body heat. Adults shared beds with plague rats for free. In the Great Famine of 1316, mothers abandoned bobbies in snowbanks, not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. And still the church told them to fast, because God was cold too. Furs were for nobles. Peasants had wool if they were lucky, and fleas whether they liked it or not. Winter came like a debt collector in chainmail, loud, merciless, and always early. And unless a villager happened to own a sheep, and the divine patience to spin its guts into something vaguely wearable, outerwear was whatever hadn't rotted off yet. In 1363, Edward III tried to enforce sumptuary laws so peasants wouldn't dress above their station. A hilarious concern, considering most of them wore the color of frostbite. The law banned fur jewels and pricey dyes, none of which had made it within 100 miles of a sheep herder's toe. Heating, hoped for. Homes were one-room miasmas of smoke and coughs. Chimneys where optional drafts were mandatory, and the floor doubled as a freezer and a toilet. Hay stuffed into tunics was the medieval north face. The wool soaked up rain like it was training for the plague. In Yorkshire, people eked warmth from trench ovens filled with hot rocks, burned half their fuel to cook the other half to simply not die. Merciless efficiency. You smelled like peat and boiled roots, and you were still shivering. Some monks swore off warm cloaks as penance. Everyone else swore off toes, and yet it passed for mercy. The baby was born in January. The firewood ran out in December. By the time the priest reached the cottage, the tiny corpse had stiffened like old bread and the baptismal water stayed pristine. No one dared bury it yet. Church law, Canon 1236, said unbaptized infants went straight to limbo. Cold theology, colder ground. They tried reviving it, smelling salts, breast milk, a bit of St. Cuthbert's toe bone pressed to the forehead. Nothing worked. The mother wept. The father asked if snow counted as holy water. In Norfolk, 1315 monks recorded 8 infants dying before baptism in one frostbitten week. The monastery counted it as a famine statistic, not a spiritual crisis. God was never late, just indifferent. Firewood was currency. Small logs, big logs, half-rotten twigs, didn't matter. If it burned, it was wealth. In winter, peasants weren't gathering firewood so much as foraging for survival coupons. Lord William of Rhuddlan once fined peasants in 1280 for theft of kindling, which really meant they dared pick up sticks on noble land. You could get whipped for that, or worse, be told to pray instead. Most villagers huddled in homes built like livestock pens, one-room mud walls, no chimney. Just a hole that hoped smoke would figure things out. The straw they slept on froze before it caught lice. Water turned to knives. Soup. That was just melted snow with regret. By January, they burned furniture. By February, they burned dung. By March, they envied the pigs. In 1315, during the Great Famine, entire families died not from hunger but from cold. They simply disintegrated in silence. No fire, no food, no saints. Meanwhile, the monasteries were reading psalms by candlelight and calling it charity. Winter wasn't just cold, it was legally sanctioned starvation. Between November and March, the sun clocked out by 4 p.m. and took every plant with it. Fields froze, livestock vanished into collective hallucination, and the surviving peasants got real intimate with frostbite, turnips, and regret. Wheat stores rotted with mold so thick it qualified as a topping. Rye bread. If the fungus Claviceps purpurea moved in congratulations, you now had a hallucinogenic loaf and a front row seat to St. Anthony's fire, spasms, vomiting, and erupting sores. Some called it divine punishment. Others just called it dinner. In 1315, England learned hunger had a sequel. 3 years of rain drowned crops, starved over 1 million people, and made casual cannibalism a dinner conversation. One chronicler from St. Albans Abbey noted corpses hanging in gallows were picked apart by starving children. No soup bones were spared. Meanwhile, stealing bread in some towns was punishable by amputation. That's right, your hand for a crust. Grand larceny in a famine. Because nothing says justice like mutilating someone for accessing the food you failed to grow. By February, the stew pot was mainly hopes and hot water. Some gnawed on leather, some on sawdust. Others just prayed to saints who'd long since stopped answering collect calls. And yet monks still fasted for Lent. The snow looked lovely if you ignored the dead goats stuffed into people's clothes. Winter wasn't a season, it was a sentence. Between November and March, villages practically hibernated in filth-lined hovels, huddling like lice under wool-soaked hay. The rich called it Michaelmas frost. The poor called it Tuesday. Forget fur coats. Peasants flayed their livestock and wore the proof. In the 1297 parish accounts of St. Botolph's 3 boys froze to death collecting firewood by the fen edge. One of them was buried in a pigskin. This wasn't unusual, it was recycling. Frostbite was called God's pruning. Chilblains got you flagellated for impurity. And when St. Cuthbert's bones failed to stop the river from freezing in 1363, people blamed the river. Food ran out by January. Salted herring or rat, pick your poison. Bread was frozen solid. Boil it in water, call it porridge, pretend it's penance. No warmth, no meat, no mercy. That's how snow angels got made, by bodies collapsing in the drifts, wrapped in matted fur, arms open like prayer or rigor mortis. And then spring came, too late as usual. The church called it temperance. The peasants called it frostbite. When December hit, the wheat was gone, the sun quit early, and everyone stopped bathing out of tradition, poverty, or both. The holy men preached that cold hands built warm souls, which was easy to say from behind stained glass windows and fur-lined theology. In 1279, Bishop John de Kirkby advised his Yorkshire flock to abstain from flesh through Lent. In January, during a famine, starvation apparently built spiritual abs. They burned peat for heat, which choked the room and blackened the lungs. Beds were straw mats soaked in urine and regret. Rats attended nightly uninvited but expected. If the cold didn't kill them, the doctrine might. And of course, that counted as grace. The harvest ended in September. Winter taxes were due by November, because nothing says holiday cheer like bleeding a village while the fields are frozen and the livestock have scurvy. England's 1275 Statute of Westminster made sure even beggars couldn't dodge tolls, because starvation wasn't a valid exemption form. The Lord still demanded his grain. The church needed its tithe. The roads were blocked, the ale was sour, and the last pig had already been turned into prayers. Peasants stripped bark off trees for soup. The monks called it fasting. In 1316, during the Great Famine, people were caught eating their own seed grain. It didn't save them, but at least they died compliant. Debt was eternal. The debtor wasn't. Sure, castles had stone walls and kings had fur cloaks, but out in the countryside, winter meant one thing: sharing a roof with the goat, or the pig, or whatever you weren't eating yet. Peasant houses didn't have insulation. They had animals. Not metaphorically, literally. Cows slept indoors for warmth, and in places like 14th century Yorkshire that counted as central heating. Don't worry, there weren't any chimneys to confuse the sheep. Just smoke curling into your eyes while your child coughed through another round of winter consumption. Medieval medicine claimed garlic on the feet cured fever. The fever disagreed. Frostbite, pray harder. Runny nose, demonic imbalance. Dead father, not the cold, just original sin. By spring only, the livestock looked healthier. Snow was not quaint. It was a burial shroud with seasonal flair. Medieval winters didn't just kill crops. They killed plans, livestock, children, teeth, fingers, and hope. In 1315, the Great Famine rolled in with early frosts and late rains, forcing villagers in Yorkshire to eat animal feed, tree bark, and sometimes each other. By February, people were digging up old famine pits and asking fewer questions about the bones they boiled. Heating was a luxury for monasteries and hallucinating saints. The average peasant had a smoke-choked hovel, a damp straw bed, and enough soul-crushing draft to make frostbite a birthright. Families warmed themselves by sleeping together, stacked like desperate pancakes under wool that smelled like rain and livestock death. There were no mittens, just medieval mitten equivalents. Rag strips, boiled urine compresses, and minor prayers to St. Medard, patron saint of not freezing your kneecaps off. In 1321, the Bishop of Winchester issued a decree to distribute coal to the poor. Translation: here's a handful of rocks, try not to die screaming. Toes went first, then fingers, then ears, then bobbies lined up beside the hearth like failed experiments. It was not uncommon to wake with a sibling frozen beside you, stiff as penance. And still they called it a mercy when the spring thaw didn't reek of corpses. Winter was less a season and more a threat. The snow didn't fall, it conquered. And the only thing lower than the temperature were the odds of surviving it without losing fingers, toes, or your will to live. Fuel ran out by January, food ran out by February, and hope ran out sometime between Advent and frostbite. Heating wasn't about comfort, it was strategy. Smoke-filled hovels packed with livestock piss buckets and disappointment. Chimneys were a rich man's fantasy. The poor just inhaled their way through the cold, wrapped in damp wool and regret. In 1284, Edward I banned coal in London because it smelled. So instead of warm, they were lawful corpses. Disease loved low temperatures and high density. So did doctors. They prescribed roasted leeches bloodletting, or, if things got serious, a warmed enema of herbs and gilt. In Paris 1392, a barber surgeon reportedly recommended heated incisions to let winter humors escape. Translation: fire wounds instead of frostbite. And somehow none of that counted as malpractice. Did mass death stop anyone from blaming witches? Of course not. In 1486, the Malleus Maleficarum warned that winter storms could be conjured by unwed women. Nothing says science like burning your neighbor because your soup froze. By March, if the rats hadn't eaten your grain, the monks had. Monasteries stockpiled food for the needy, then tithed the starving for spiritual favor. Pray, pay, perish. Rinse if you had water, which you didn't. They called it divine testing. Most people failed. Winters were less a season and more a slow-motion exorcism. The snow came early, the firewood ran out fast, and the saints were overbooked. Peasants prayed to St. Medard for dry weather and failing that started licking icicles for divine hydration. According to a 14th century Franciscan text, melting snow on splinters of the true cross could cure frostbite, which is helpful assuming you had access to one of the 43 documented true crosses floating around Europe. Actual medicine offered little besides bleeding spoonfuls of powdered toad and advice to sleep near sheep. That last part wasn't metaphoric. Warmth was a livestock-based privilege. By January, the food was gone. By February, they were boiling leather. By March, only the relics were eating well. The good news was they'd managed to salt a wheel of cheese before the snow hit. The bad news: the mice got it. Again. Somewhere between the cracked walls, the dirt floor, and that thing scuttling behind the watertight wooden Jesus storing dairy was a pipe dream wrapped in frostbite. No grain, no meat, just the echo of prayers and squeaking. Winter was less a season and more a siege. In 1315, crop failure wasn't a bad harvest. It was a pan-European famine. The Great Famine. Capital G, capital F. People ate dogs, dead relatives, and in Flanders allegedly children, though records dispute whether they cooked them or just let them freeze. Either way, the recipes were short. And the church, useless as ever. In 1321, monks in Dijon blamed lepers for poisoning wells, then burned dozens alive. God had left the chat, but his fan club stayed busy. Fires burned low. Ale froze in mugs. Fingers blackened for sport. By March, they were boiling shoe leather and calling it stew. And the mice, fat. Medieval winter wasn't a season. It was a sentence. They didn't bundle up for snow. They braced for months of freezing rot crop ghosts and pious frostbite. Wool was rough shoes where wooden and central heating was called dying near the hearth. And that's if you had a hearth. Most peasants shared their hut with livestock just to survive the night. Nothing says coziness like a goat farting on your blanket while snow leaks through the thatch. Roads, hilarious. More like ankle-deep mud rivers with attitude. In 1315, during the Great Famine, chroniclers in Britain recorded ox carts stuck for days outside Bishop's Lynn. Not metaphorically stuck, physically sinking. Transport turned to funerals on wheels, assuming the corpse didn't slide off en route. Salt was scarce, firewood scarcer. Vitamin C was outlawed by nature itself. And yet monks still fasted for Lent in February on purpose. Because what's another 6 weeks of empty stomachs and divine guilt when everyone already looks like famine in a cloak? God's mercy, they said. God never answered. Ah, winter. The season of saint starvation, and if you were really lucky, frozen human excrement stacked like divine punishment behind your hovel. Snow didn't hide the stench, it preserved it. In Norwich 1287, a carpenter was fined for heaping filth where the townfolk trod. The real scandal, that anyone noticed one pile from another. Firewood was scarce. Coal was a luxury. So were tips of fingers. Chilblains ate hands, frostbite claimed toes, and anyone over 60 was considered frostproof solely through attrition. Monks at Fountains Abbey dug 3 mass graves in January 1316, not from plague, just cold and crop failure. Funerals happened faster than meals. By morning, even the rats had church privileges. At least they found warmth. They called it wedding season, which was adorable considering it doubled as the famine quarter. By November, England's ground was a frozen tomb, and the summer crops were long gone, or never sprouted, because it rained for 4 weeks straight, and the saints were apparently on strike. Grain spoiled in storage barrels of salt pork ran out by Christmas, and suddenly fasting wasn't a virtue. It was economics. They held their weddings in January not because it was romantic, but because by then half the in-laws were already dead and the others couldn't fight back. In 1316, during the Great Famine, parents dumped children at the doors of monasteries like flaming logs. Take it, Father, it's still warm. No food, no seed, no cure, just vows and frostbite. Nothing says celebration like starving in a chapel, and in medieval Europe feasting was mandatory, even if there wasn't a crumb left to consecrate. Winter was famine with better branding. Fields froze, mills broke, pottage became hope soup. And yet December 6th, still St. Nicholas's Day. Candlemas. Light a candle, freeze politely. Monks in St. Albans recorded skipping meat for 150 holy days a year. God wouldn't eat, so neither could they. Lent hit hardest, 6 cold weeks of no meat, no milk, no joy. And fish, if caught, was soaked in brine until it resembled salted despair. One 13th century Lent dish from Paris included dried peas mashed with herring entrails, divines suffering through legumes. Faith was nourishment, until it was. They made it illegal to be poor, then punished the symptoms. In 1515, the town council of Norwich banned begging in winter, unless one had a license to freeze with dignity. No firewood, no food, but a parchment that said, "Congratulations, you may perish quietly." Charity was outlawed. Vagrancy was criminal. And cold was inevitable. Frostbite wasn't a medical emergency. It was natural selection in action, unless you were a monk holed up in a stone abbey that doubled as a cheese cave and a scriptoria sauna. Everyone else slept beside goat's piss buckets and regret. Heating came from one fireplace per hamlet, and still they blamed laziness, not frost, not famine. The poor apparently chose hypothermia. Monks got blankets, villagers got sermons. Both froze, but only one blamed it on sin. Winter was not a season, it was a punishment wrapped in frostbite and famine. In 1315, the Great Famine hit Europe like divine wrath with mold on its breath. 3 straight years of rain drowned crops, drowned cattle, drowned hope. Families boiled tree bark, chewed leather belts, and prayed that their children would at least die slower than the hogs. At Westminster Abbey, the monks wrapped themselves in wool cloaks and chanted through their candle-lit vespers. In Yorkshire, peasants wrapped their infants in straw and prayed they wouldn't wake up blue. By the 3rd freeze, they stopped nomming the dead. The saints didn't answer. The priests did, with lectures about gluttony. In case that didn't warm, the sole Paris physicians recommended bleeding onion salves and powdered emeralds stirred into wine. Because if the cold didn't kill you, bankruptcy might. Meanwhile, English law under Edward II required tithes even during famine. God may have emptied the fields, but the church still collected. Winter was not endured. It was survived by accident. Monks got blankets. Everyone else got God's silence. Nobles died warm, if at all. They wrapped winter in ermine, roasted swans over open hearths, and called it suffering when the wine froze in their goblets. Meanwhile, peasants watched frost crawl up their walls, sleeping 5 to a lice-riddled bed with a dead pig for insulation. That wasn't metaphor. That was bedtime. In 1315, 3 solid years of rain turned England into a mold pit. Crops failed, grain rotted, livestock drowned where they stood. The Great Famine didn't just kill, it hollowed. Villagers clawed bark off trees and boiled it, thinking tannin soup might outwit January. Mothers abandoned infants in hedgerows. Cannibalism was reported in Pont Saint-Esprit. The bishop denounced it as sin. No one confessed. The rich burned oak. The poor burned dung or nothing. There was no central heating, just central shivering, and drafty Latin sermons about how winter built character, preferably in silence. In 1388, Parliament passed the Statute of Cambridge to keep beggars from leaving their plague pits in search of warmer gutters. Charity was a crime. So was migration. So was not dying discreetly. Feet rotted, fingers blackened. Snow seeped through thatched ceilings like guilt. Monks in Lindisfarne recorded frostbite as divine chastisement. By February, half the choir had gangrene. The psalms continued, in Latin, through broken teeth. And yet the castle stayed, lit, the tapestries stiff with imported dust. Winter didn't kill the nobility. Drafts did. Sometimes, eventually, maybe. But by then they were buried in wool, pork, and lies, and under that purring like cats the peasants still froze. They said spring was for resurrection. First you had to survive the ice and the hunger. And if you were lucky, your child's cough not turning into a grave. Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't a season, it was a biological test. Crops were gone. Livestock froze on hoof. And by January, the villagers were eating bark boiled into paste and praying to Saint Apollonia, patron saint of toothaches, for the strength to chew it. In 1315, England ran face first into the Great Famine. 3 years of rain, rot, and ruin. Stories circulated of mothers eating their children, not poetic metaphor. Actual culinary mothers. Local courts tossed out more theft cases than harvests. One in Bergen, Norway, tried to outlaw bread theft once there was no bread. The monks at Westminster Abbey logged freezer deaths in the margins of psalms. Men curled up beneath chapel eaves. They froze during compline. Not even God wanted their breath fogging his nave. And when March finally came, the ice melted, revealing the bodies it had borrowed. Of all the medieval smells, moldy straw, damp wool, theological arrogance, none hit harder than winter rot. Bodies didn't decompose properly in the cold. They just waited, stacked in crypts buried shallow in frozen ground, or shoved into churches like God had a side hustle in meat storage. In Cologne 1281, one chronicler complained the cathedral reeked of saints and sinners alike. Sanctity apparently wasn't deodorant. Winter was a siege. No sun to dry the laundry, no warmth to bury the plague cart backlog, and no scent strong enough to beat 6 months of accumulated corpse sweat. Want to know why incense was big in monasteries? Because Brother Thomas was fermenting in the cellar. Cold preserved the dead, then spring defrosted them, slowly, tragically, all at once. Cozy, sure. If cozy means frostbite, famine, and dying in a room full of your own family's breath. Medieval winters weren't harsh, they were annual slow-motion executions. Firewood was hoarded like gold, insulation was a goat in the bed, and roofs leaked more than the church's treasury under Alexander VI. In 1315, the Great Famine kicked off with non-stop rain across northern Europe. Wheat drowned. Salt failed. Livestock starved. By Christmas, people were digging up buried grain and chewing boiled leather shoes. Cannibalism was whispered, then practiced, then normalized. Monks in Yorkshire recorded without irony that corpses were being exhumed for stew. Saints didn't come that winter, only cold, and the rats never left.